The Cold War by Joshua Patuto, Jake Lane, Malachi Gray, and Jordyn Todhunter. What was the Cold War? The Cold War was not like any other war. It was more political, much more than just a bunch of guns. Technically, that's every war. When you think about it, a country won't just go and take on the world for domination of the globe. It has to go through some stuff first. So let's begin. Prologue. World War I. The birth of the USSR. The only thing you need to know about World War I is that because Russia joined the war, the people got mad because everything was going wrong. Famine, lack of resources, and it's Russia, so that's pretty bad. The people revolted and the revolutionists won, but not for long. You see, after they won, they were even worse. But a man by the name Vladimir Lenin led a group of communists that wanted to take Russia. Another revolution broke out, lasting until 1919, with a victory going to the communists. World War II. Almost everybody knows World War II. The Germans were the bad guys, Japan was their sidekick, and they almost took over the world. But Russia and the U.S. blew them to smithereens. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? You see, the U.S. joined the war because of a small attack in 1941 on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. But the Soviet Union joined because they were invaded by the Nazis, also in 1941. After 1942, the Allies started to turn the tides. The Nazis were losing ground. On June 6, 1944, the British, Canadians, and Americans launched D-Day. The Soviets reached Berlin, and the war was over. But at what cost? Here's a map of World War II. Here's a map of Cold War military alliances. World War II Epilogue. Once the Second World War ended, a new enemy was formed in Europe. That enemy was the Soviet Union. The Soviets were obviously angry about the fact that they had been invaded twice in the last 30 years and wanted to make sure that the number would not go to 3. They made border states out of the freed nations they occupied while they were pushing the Nazis faster than you can say anything. Those border states were supposed to be fully free nations with fair elections to decide for themselves. With ideology, they would like to be democracy, communist, socialist, etc. Eastern Europe. After those fair elections in the Eastern Europe, every country in the Soviet territories became communist. Who would have known? Anyway, the countries would remain communist for several years until the late 80s. It is mainly about the Korean War than the Vietnam War. The Korean War, or the Forgotten War, was from 1950 to 1953, and it was caused by the aftermath of World War II. A few weeks before the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Russia was down with the Germans and focused on the attack on Japan, while the U.S. was coming from the south and the Russians from the north. In the end, they split Korea into 2 pieces. The north part would be influenced by Russia and the south part by the MURICA. Now, because the words north and south cannot be put in the same sentence with the word Civil War in the mix, we can guess what happened next. The Korean War. The communist North Korea attacked the South, and the South could barely hold themselves up. Then the UN came in, and with the USA, they pushed them back up to the Chinese border. China did the same thing as the U.S. and attacked the winning foes. They pushed them back to the modern borders and signed a truce. Here's a map of before and after. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was really complicated and unique. You may think that the United States could not lose a war unless it was against Asian farmers. That, however, is not the full story. You see, before World War II, France owned it as a colony. In 1940, Japan invaded Vietnam after the Germans took over France. After World War II, French tried to come back and reclaim the lost land, but the people revolted and gained independence. But much like Korea, it was divided by North and South. The communist North attacked the South. The U.S. got involved, and you might be thinking it's basically the same as the Korean War, but that is very much not true because Russia and China threatened the U.S. with war if they invaded. The U.S. could not invade North Vietnam, so they just defended Cuba. So here is where it gets a bit political. Have you ever heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, if you have, then good for you. But if you haven't, then boy, do we have a story for you. Okay, Here's some backstory. On March 22nd, 1962, Cuba, a Caribbean island, decided to be communist. So because the U.S. had Islamophobia, the fear of communism, and Cuba was right there, so they decided to invade on April 16th, 1962. But because the USMC sucks at killing Third World Communist armies, they failed. Cuban Missile Annihilations. The Cuban Missile Crisis was probably the most tense 3 hours of anyone's life in October of 1962. The U.S. put nuclear missiles on the north coast of Turkey, following Moscow, the capital of Russia. The Soviets saw this and replied quite nicely by putting their missile in Cuba, facing the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. The world was holding their breath as the end of the world was right there on the doorstep. JFK and the leader of Russia, whose name I don't know, I'm going to be in college by the time I pronounce it right, got into a discussion and decided to get rid of the missiles. The assassination of JFK. On November 22, 1963, the President of the United States was assassinated in broad daylight. It was a sunny day in Dallas, Texas, as the President was in his car, waving at the crowd, when suddenly there was a gunshot. The President was in shock. The bullet missed, but then came another. U.S. leaving Vietnam. In 1973, the U.S. finally left Vietnam. It was two most embarrassing loss that the U.S. would never forget. The public media broadcasting the war showed people the death of the first hand. The people started protesting in the streets of New York. USSR versus Afghanistan. 3, 2, 1, fight. In December of 1973 to February of 1983, the USSR invaded the country of Afghanistan, much like the Middle Eastern wars of today. With the U.S., the urban modern strategies of Russia were not prepared for the guerrilla tactics of the enemy troops. The enemy came out of nowhere, and it was impossible to know when the enemy would strike. Here's a map of Soviet invasion routes and the territory controlled by the Soviet forces during the war in Afghanistan. Chernobyl. You know, I can count the amount of times that I've been to Chernobyl on my two hands. It's 14. This is because in 1986, a nuclear reactor blew up and released radiation across Europe. It was mainly focused on the city of Chernobyl, where 50,000 used to live, but now it's a ghost town. And the walls came tumbling down. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was finally torn down after almost 30 years of oppression. It was originally put up by the Soviets to stop immigration from east to west Berlin. It separated family, friends, and all of Berlin until it finally came down in November of 1989. The fall of the USSR. On December 26, 1991, the United Soviet Social Republics crumbled in front of the world. The economic loss and the political instability made the Soviets fall on top of themselves. And here are all the sources that we used. The end.